The shelter was silent until a German Shepherd puppy let out a heartbreaking cry. His tiny paw pressed against the cold metal gate, reaching for the man he recognized. But what happened next wasn't the joyful reunion everyone expected. It was something so emotional, it left the entire shelter in tears. The shelter was unusually quiet that morning, except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of dogs shuffling in their kennels. Rows of metal cages lined the walls, each holding a story of abandonment, hope, and longing. But in kennel number 23, a small German Shepherd puppy sat perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on the entrance. He seemed to be waiting for someone, anyone, to notice him. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. A man in a beige jacket walked slowly past the kennels, glancing at the dogs with a heavy expression. When he reached kennel number 23, the puppy's world seemed to change. His ears perked up, and in that instant, recognition flashed in his eyes. He pressed his tiny paw against the cold metal bars and let out a soft, trembling whimper. The man froze. It was a sound that pierced through the silence, a cry filled with hope, confusion, and heartbreak all at once. Other staff members turned, their heads curious, as the puppy began to whine louder, pawing frantically at the cage door. The shelter, which had felt lifeless just moments ago, now held its breath. Something extraordinary was about to happen. The man knelt slowly, his knees pressing against the cold concrete floor. His hands trembled as he reached toward the cage, and the puppy instantly pushed his nose through the bars, desperate to touch him. Then, a single tear slid down the man's cheek. He whispered the puppy's name, barely audible, but the German Shepherd recognized it instantly. His tail thumped against the metal floor, and he let out a cry so full of joy and pain that it echoed through the shelter. Memories came flooding back. This was the man who had held him on his first night home, who had fed him from his palm, who had laughed when the clumsy pup stumbled over his own paws. The puppy's cries turned into a soft whine, and he pressed his paw harder against the bars as if pleading, "Take me home, please." The shelter staff watched silently, their hearts tightening at the sight. But as the man looked into the puppy's hopeful eyes, his own expression changed. Grief replaced joy. He lowered his head and whispered, I can't." The words were soft, but the puppy froze, tilting his head in confusion. He didn't understand yet, but he was about to. The man stayed crouched by the cage, his hands still resting against the cold metal. His voice trembled as he finally spoke, more to himself than to anyone else. "I lost my home," he said, his eyes wet. I couldn't even take care of myself, let alone you." The puppy cocked his head, not understanding the words, only the heavy sorrow behind them. He explained to the shelter worker, his voice cracking, that he had lost his job months ago. Then, everything had unraveled. His house, his savings, and finally, his ability to care for his beloved companion. Dropping the puppy at the shelter had been the hardest thing he'd ever done. Seeing him now, tail wagging despite everything, shattered him all over again. The puppy whined softly, pawing at the bars, his eyes full of questions he couldn't ask. The man pressed his forehead against the cage and let the tears come. Around them, the shelter was quiet, but the weight of the moment was deafening. Even the staff wiped their eyes. The man wanted nothing more than to take his dog home, but reality had built a wall higher than his love could climb. The shelter worker knelt beside the man, her voice gentle but firm. "We can hold him for a short while," she said, "but adoptions move fast. He's young, and families are already asking about him." Her words were meant to comfort, yet they sliced through his heart like a knife. He knew what she was really saying. He didn't have long. The man nodded, his throat tight. He looked back at the puppy, who pressed his little nose against the bars as if begging him not to leave again. For a brief moment, he imagined a different life. A small apartment, long walks in the park, the warmth of his companion sleeping by his side. But reality crushed the dream. He had nowhere to go, and every day was a struggle just to survive. I just want him to be happy," he whispered, his voice breaking. The puppy tilted his head, wagging his tail slightly, as if still believing his human would take him home. The man forced a smile through the tears and kissed the top of the puppy's head through the fence, silently promising that he would find a way to return before time ran out. Days passed, and the little German Shepherd puppy waited by the gate every morning. Each sound of footsteps on the concrete floor made his ears perk up, his eyes searching for the familiar figure he loved. But as people came and went, laughing families, curious children, kind strangers, the man he longed for never appeared. The shelter workers noticed. "He hardly plays with the other pups," one of them said softly. "He just waits." They gave him toys, treats, and soft blankets, but nothing could replace the comfort of the man who had once held him. At night, when the lights dimmed, the puppy would curl into a tight ball, whimpering quietly, his tiny chest rising and falling. In sorrow, one evening, a family stopped by his kennel. The little girl pressed her face to the bars and smiled. "He's perfect," she said, giggling as the puppy licked her fingers. For a moment, hope flickered, but then he looked past her, scanning the room for the man who had promised he would return. When he didn't see him, his tail lowered again. The family hesitated, sensing the sadness in his eyes, and moved on. The puppy stayed by the gate, waiting, heartbroken but loyal. One rainy morning, the shelter staff noticed the puppy hadn't moved from his spot by the gate. His fur was damp from the cold drafts, and his eyes were red from sleepless nights. That was when the shelter director arrived with a somber look on her face. She had just received a phone call, news that would break the puppy's heart if only. He could understand. The man he had been waiting for would never return. He had been elderly, living alone, and had passed away just a few days after surrendering the puppy. He had left no family, no one to claim the little German shepherd he had loved so much. The shelter workers exchanged silent glances, each one feeling a lump form in their throat. They opened the kennel and gently lifted the trembling puppy into their arms. He buried his face against their chest, as if sensing that something was terribly wrong. The room fell silent except for the soft patter of rain against the windows. Even the other dogs seemed to sense the weight of the moment. In that instant, everyone realized the puppy's loyalty had outlasted the only human he had ever known, and now he was truly alone. Days passed, and the little German shepherd stayed curled in his kennel, grieving in silence. The shelter staff refused to give up on him. They spent hours sitting by his side, speaking softly, and letting him know he was not alone. Slowly he began to lift his head when they approached, his tail giving the faintest wag. One morning, a gentle-looking woman arrived at the shelter, holding a worn photograph in her hand. It was a picture of the puppy with his late owner, smiling together on a sunny porch. Tears filled her eyes as she explained she had been the man's neighbor and had promised to check on the dog if anything ever happened. She knelt, whispering the puppy's name, and he froze, then leapt into her arms as if he had been waiting for her all along. The adoption papers were signed that same day. As they left the shelter, the puppy looked back one last time, his eyes brighter than they had been in weeks. For the first time since losing his beloved human, he felt warmth again. His new family promised to love him fiercely, carrying forward the memory of the man he would never forget.